Hey gang, thanks for hanging with me while I'm going through this cold. I know I sound a little bit nasally, but I wanted to get some stories out to you. Going in the Wayback Machine for this, and I'm calling it Stories from the Vault. So, leave us not be hasty. Let's get it on. He fooled everyone. I was a member of the slam poetry scene. Basically, it was an excuse to get people to listen to performance poetry by adding a competitive element to things. After running through the small scene in my city and wanting to branch out and push my career further, I started visiting places within driving distance that I could spit. This led me to Charlotte, North Carolina. I started at their local team venue, where we competed to be a part of a squad that went to a national competition every year. I was doing well and accepted into the local crew pretty readily. This led to longer stays and features at some of the other venues in the city. I started going to one that was particularly popular and good for selling CDs. And that's where I met him. He worked as a barback, occasionally got on stage and shared, frankly, shitty poems. He was a brother of the host, and everyone knew and liked him. He slowly started flirting with me more and more. Although in my loose days searching for acceptance and love everywhere, something always kept me leery. I gladly accepted the drinks he sent over, smoked weed with the group in the stockroom between sets, and hung out at parties and events. And I always had the tickle in my gut warning me to not get too close. But over a year or two, we continued to become friends. After a while, he started calling and texting more often, poking me on Facebook daily and sending messages about wanting to be more than friends, that he wanted to find a snow bunny and settle down. Yeah, I'm white and he was black. Again, I never really entertained it. There was something gnawing at me. The crazy in his eyes too hard to miss. Eventually, though, I moved to Denver to take a position teaching poetry and working at my friend's law firm. The second Christmas I was out in Denver, I got a call. A friend from Charlotte relayed the following. This guy had found his white girl and gotten married. They seemed very happy at first, but slowly began fighting more and more. Things spilled over into the venue, and they had to be separated by friends from physically attacking one another right there in public. One friend, later thinking back, remembered the last time she saw them together, he was pushing his wife, followed by her throwing a drink in his face, and then scratching his neck deep enough to draw blood. My friend said after the couple had been dragged away from each other, she sat there with him and smoked a cigarette. My friend laughed about it and told him, you guys are going to kill each other one day. During Christmas of that year, his wife just stopped coming to the bi-weekly events they both used to attend regularly. He explained in a way that they were on a break. Time went by. No one really questioned that they hadn't seen or heard from her in a while, thinking she was just breaking from the whole scene in order to put distance between herself and her husband. Her parents, however, had also not heard from their daughter since their Thanksgiving dinner. They would call him and he would say everything was fine and then just blow them off. This continued until a week after Christmas. Knowing their daughter would never miss a holiday without at least a call, they got in touch with the police and sent them to the couple's home for a wellness check. The cops arrived, knocked on the door, and the guy let them in. They asked him where his wife was, and he just replied, "She's in the bedroom." He pointed to the room, and that's where they found her. She had been dead for weeks and was just rotting on their bed. And he killed their little dog, too. During that time, he had been attending events hosting hip-hop nights, and even publishing a blog on making marriage work on one of the local organization's sites. He never once let on that every night he was going home and sleeping with his murdered wife. The sickest part of it all, He had a child from another relationship, a daughter who he got to celebrate every other holiday with. That Christmas, they opened gifts, had dinner, cuddled up on the couch and watched movies, less than 50 feet away from her decaying stepmother. I don't know what would have happened if I had ever taken him up on his offer to date, but I do know that my gut and I are always going to stay on speaking terms, and I will always, always listen to it. House cleaning horror. In the mid-'80s, my mom was a cleaner in Australia. She would go clean houses in suburban areas and would sometimes do houses in rural and wine regions, as we lived near both. She would leave business cards at local shops, and she got most of her business that way, and some through referrals and word of mouth, too. One day, she got a call from a lady who sounded like she was around 60, asking my mom to clean her old farmhouse. She made a lot of odd demands, and my mom would usually meet clients before taking on new business. But in this case, the lady didn't want to meet my mom and said she would leave the keys under the front doormat. My mom agreed, mainly because the lady was quite obviously wealthy and was offering to pay my mom substantially more than she would reasonably expect. Mom went to the house on a Monday morning and said she already had felt unnerved by the long driveway up to the house. The house was essentially in the middle of a very large and very empty property. But she found the keys and started cleaning. About an hour into the clean, she heard the back door shut. Mom had been told that no one would be in the house, so she immediately felt unsafe. She stood frozen in the kitchen for what she said felt like 3 to 4 minutes, although she said it could have been much longer. She couldn't see any other cars on the property. She wanted to leave immediately, but had 2 rooms left to do, both of which were bedrooms. She said time passed and she heard nothing else. She decided that perhaps it was nothing, or perhaps something had fallen, and it wasn't the door after all. She walked up the hallway and stepped into the bedroom, and all over the bed were black and white photos. As my mom got closer, she realized the photos were all of her. Some were taken out of our family home. Many others were taken out of other houses Mom had cleaned, and some were taken through windows or over fences. Before she left, my mom used the house phone to call the police and immediately drove to the end of the driveway. The old lady ended up being investigated, but she just claimed that there would have been a break-in. But she just continued to claim that there was a break-in. After some time, the police stopped their search and we ended up moving to a new town 4 months later. Every time my mom tells this story, I get serious chills. Absolutely a true story, too. To this day, my mom is convinced the lady had something to do with it, but for why and what purpose, she doesn't know. The Man in the Basement. During my early 20s, I worked as a meter reader in Iowa City, Iowa. A meter reader is the person who records how much electricity, gas, or water you've used each month. If your meters are on the inside and you want an accurate bill, a meter reader must enter your home, whether you let them in or not. Just to clarify, we only entered homes if consent was given when the customer first signed up for service. Some customers also provided us with keys. Entering a home when the owner wasn't present was something that I never got used to, though. No matter how loudly I knocked, I never shook the uneasy feeling that I wasn't welcome. I mean, the inside of a home is the ultimate private space, right? A home's exterior is just the image of ourselves that we project the rest of the world to see. But the further you venture inside, the closer you come to truly seeing what kind of person lives there. And if you want the raw, unfiltered truth, head for the basement. I hate basements. I've seen walls that look like giant static-filled TV screens, until realizing it was roaches scurrying across a white background. Cobwebs so thick and dusty that it looked like the cotton candy machine at the county fair exploded. I've seen rats, snakes, feces, weapons, neglected children, abused pets, homeless squatters, bizarre sexual items, makeshift meth labs, and even a coffin. I mean, there are rational explanations for all of those things. Well, maybe not the coffin. But there was one basement where what I found was beyond the grasp of logic, and that's what made it so terrifying. It was an old apartment house, and from the outside it looked like every other house on the block. I entered the back door and found myself at the top of a staircase. I ran my hand along the wall until it grazed a light switch, and I flipped it, but no lights turned on, and I wasn't carrying a flashlight. A typical route I was on involved 5 or 6 hours of walking, so I carried as little as possible, and oftentimes I used the light from my handheld screen, but it only illuminated whatever was about a foot in front of it. So, armed with the world's worst lantern, I made my way down into the darkness. And once at the bottom, I blindly shuffled across the room, one baby step at a time. With arms outstretched and head down, I eventually reached the far side of the basement. I shined the dim light from my handheld along the wall and discovered 2 doors. Each door led to its own small room. I chose the door on the right and found the meters in the far corner. As I entered my readings, I began hearing noises coming from the other room. Something in there was moving, and there was a whimpering that grew louder the longer I listened. I eventually realized it was a dog, and it sounded weak and distressed. I tried to open the door, but it was locked, and at that point, the dog was scratching at the other side of the door. I felt helpless, and I reported it when I got back to the office, but I couldn't shake the thought of that dog. It stuck with me over the next month, until it was time to return for another meter reading. So there I was, 1 month later, back in that basement. At least this time I knew where the meters were located, so I shuffled back to the little room on the right while keeping my ears open for any sounds coming from the other room. This time, I didn't hear anything. I read the meters and started making my way back, but I couldn't shake the memory of that dog. Was it still trapped inside that room? My curiosity got the best of me. I stood outside the door for a few moments, listening. Still nothing. And that's when I made a huge mistake. I tried to open the door. I had no more than jiggled the doorknob when I first heard it. Screams. Blood-curdling screams unlike anything I'd ever heard. Sounds that I didn't think a human was even capable of producing. Short, piercing, high-pitched shrieks, followed abruptly by a low, drawn-out guttural moan that ultimately morphed into something that I can only describe as crying, but much louder. And it was all over the place, like some sort of psychotic, free-form jazz. I stumbled backwards, nearly losing my balance, and I shouted something like, "Hello, who's in there?" There was no response, just screams. I called out again, "Are you okay? Do you need some help?" Still no response, just more screams. And there was no doubt that I yelled loud enough for whoever it was in there to hear me. But whoever it was didn't want my help. They wanted me gone. I fumbled my way through the darkened room toward the exit. When I reached the top of the stairs, I just stood there listening. I was trying to wrap my mind around what I was hearing. I waited for the screaming to stop, but it never did. When I finally left, it was still as loud and demented as when it began. I felt relieved, but that quickly vanished when I realized that I was going to have to do it all over again next month. Once again, I reported what I heard, but again, nothing came of it. As my return drew nearer, a sense of dread grew inside me. I mean, what kind of lunatic sits alone in total darkness and silence? My mind created endless explanations for what kind of hell lay beyond that door. By the time I'd returned, I'd built this guy up in my mind so much that anyone other than the devil himself would have been a letdown. But there was no sign of him the next month, or even the next several months. I'd nearly given up on solving the mystery when a stroke of luck pulled me back in. One night, I went to a concert with my friend Laura. After the show, I gave her a ride home. She'd moved somewhat recently, so she had to give me the directions. I didn't pay much attention to where she was leading me until she pointed to a house a ways up the street. I couldn't believe it. She had moved into the house with the mysterious room in the basement. I began to ask, this sounds weird, but have you ever noticed anything odd about the basement at your... And I couldn't even finish my sentence. She blurted out, yeah, a crazy guy lives down there. Finally, I had confirmation. She went on to tell me that even though her apartment was in the attic, she often heard him yelling late at night. But that wasn't all. She had actually met him. One day, while walking to her car, she saw him standing on the lawn. She said he stood perfectly still with no expression on his face, and he was directly in her path, so she cautiously made her way around him. She noticed he was staring at her, so she offered a friendly hi as she passed. He had no reaction except for one unsettling exception. He stuck out his tongue, then quickly sucked it back into his mouth and resumed acting like a statue. Thoroughly creeped out, she got in her car and drove away. 2 or 3 months later, I finally met him myself. I entered the house's back door like I had so many months before. But this time, something was different. There was a light on in the basement. I peered down the staircase, and at the bottom, a ragged-looking dog was staring back at me. It was the same dog that I'd heard during my first visit. Then I noticed something else. Behind the dog, I could see a pair of bare feet. The ceiling blocked my view of the rest of whoever was standing there, but it didn't matter. I knew it was him, and I should have left right then and there, but I didn't. I know this probably doesn't make sense, but at that point my desire to finally get some answers outweighed my fears. I shakily called out, "Meter reader," and started to make my descent. As I made my way down, more of him was revealed. He looked to be middle-aged. His head was shaved and his eyes were wild. He was wearing pants but no shirt. What I remember the most was how lean and sinewy his body looked. It had the look of a body that was never at rest. I explained to him who I was and what I was doing there. And to my surprise, not only did he talk to me, but he actually sounded somewhat normal. The volume and pitch of his voice was odd, but he said the same sorts of things that people typically say to meter readers. I even started to doubt whether or not he was the same guy I had been hearing screaming. But his behavior slowly removed all doubt. As I read the meters, he rapidly paced back and forth. He was constantly wringing his hands together and spastically cocking his head from side to side. The longer he talked, the more agitated he became. He began grimacing, and little verbal tics started popping up in his speech. Every so often, he would blur out a loud "aw" in the middle of a sentence. He was trying to suppress these sounds, but it was a losing battle. I started to make my way to the exit, and he followed. His verbal outbursts grew louder and more frequent. I was petrified. When I reached the stairs, I drew our conversation to an end and said goodbye. As I turned to head up the staircase, he could no longer hold it in. Screams. The very same unforgettable screams that I had heard coming from the locked room. I ran up the stairs as fast as my legs would carry me, flung the door open, and rushed back into the daylight. A month or two later, I had a couple of friends, including Lara, over to my place. I was excited to tell her about my encounter, but as I was relaying what happened, I could tell that something else was on her mind. When I finished telling my story, she told me about something she'd seen a couple of weeks earlier. One day, she noticed lights flashing outside her window. She looked outside just in time to see police officers placing the man from the basement in the back seat of a squad car. She later found out from another tenant that the guy had attacked someone with a knife. That was the last we ever saw of him. I don't know what became of the man in the basement. I'd like to think that he got the help he needed, but maybe that's just because I'd rather not think about any alternatives. The weed wasn't worth it. I was never one to ever pass up an opportunity for a good deal on some high-grade cannabis. So when I received a text from a friend of mine telling me that he could sell me a quarter ounce of some good shit for $25, I jumped at the chance. He led me on all day, telling me he would be dropping it off in the evening. Then evening came, and so did another text saying he'd drop by later that night. And finally, at 11:30 that night, I received a text that sent a ping of anxiety running through me. The text read, "Sup, man? I'm headed out of town for the night. Your sack is in the garage under the ladder." I knew exactly what that entailed. I was to walk 5 blocks to his old residence, a mutual friend's house where he lived in a loft in the garage, slip in unnoticed by the neighbors, search until I found it, leave the money, and then be on my merry way. Simple, right? Wrong. The walk started off sketchy enough with the lone streetlight on the block going out as I laughed, plunging me into this unnatural pseudo-darkness. I walked along in silence, the only sound coming from the highway some distance away. I'd walked this walk before, even at that hour, but I couldn't shake the anticipation that was happening in my gut. I reached the house, which I have to say is absolutely terrifying at night. Something just didn't seem right. My friend was very strict with his bedtimes, and that meant the house was dark at exactly 10 p.m. each night. But tonight, there was a glow coming from the first floor. That could have meant any number of things. Maybe he had other friends over, brought a girl home, and got a late-night snack. I quickly reassured myself as I stepped through the door into the pitch-black garage. I closed the door behind me and got to searching. The garage was separated into an upstairs and downstairs to save space. Upstairs there was a washer and dryer, while downstairs there was a box of storage that went under the stairs, forming a cave-like lair. I'm not going to lie, it felt like a robbery simulator what I was doing, rummaging through my friend's garage looking for drugs. My heart was racing at that point. It really started racing, though, when I heard heavy footfalls stomping their way toward the inside garage entrance. I had kicked over a paint can by accident, so they probably had heard it. Now, my first instinct told me that I should make myself known. I mean, it was my friend's place after all. He probably even knew about the whole deal. We'd laugh, he'd point out where it was, and I'd be on my merry way. But that's when I realized something. My friend didn't own a single pair of boots. In a split instant, I had ducked down under the floorboards behind some boxes. The door outside was quite far away, and the footsteps quickly approached, so escape was not an option. I had to hide. I was so confused. I felt like I was in a slasher movie, hand over my mouth to keep me from hyperventilating and everything. I listened as the door slammed open, the footsteps creaking slowly along the floorboards just inches to my right. Whoever it was paced around the garage for what seemed like ages, grunting and taking heavy labored breaths. They stopped at the top of the stairs, never making their way down, though. Soon enough, they made their way back into the house, slamming the door behind them. As soon as the door clicked, I bolted, and I didn't stop running until I was back home tucked away in my bed. I turned every single light in the house on for the rest of the night. I wasn't about to get the cops involved with this situation, just in case they might go searching and get my friend in trouble. so I simply sent him a text message and went to sleep. I woke to 2 texts in the morning. The first was a message from my dealer friend asking me if I was all right. The second was a text from the friend who owned the house, telling me that he'd gotten stuck at a friend's house overnight. I was so fucking confused. Later that day, the friend with the house sent me news links over Facebook with no caption. It was a news report about a burglary and a murder that took place on my friend's street. 2 houses had already been confirmed as being broken into in the middle of the night. The first was the home of an injured veteran. He was found in the bedroom, a 9mm slug lodged into his head, and all the valuables in the house gone. The second house broken into was my friend's. Scumbags on the Prowl. This happened about 15 years ago when I was 12 and my younger brother was around 2. I was with my mom, my baby brother, my other brother who was about 10 at the time, and a friend. It was a weekend and we were at the mall. It might have been around Halloween because I remember my baby brother was wearing some kind of cowboy thing with a hat. I should say that my brother was a really cute baby, so it wasn't unusual for random people to comment about him while we were out. We were in a Burger King waiting in line when this guy walked in behind us and almost immediately started going on about how cute my brother was. My mom looked up at him and said she also saw a woman with a baby standing near him, so she just kind of figured this guy was a dad and she didn't think it was unusual. We forgot about it, ate, and then went shopping. We were in a CD store when we noticed the guy again, but this time he was with another man around the same age. They were both in their 40s or 50s, and one was a little taller, but they were both chubby. I remember the shorter guy wore glasses. There wasn't really anything distinct about them that would put them apart from anybody else, and I think that's the scariest part for me. They were talking to each other when they walked in behind us, and while we were shopping, one of them stayed at the front of the store, while the other one circled around us in the aisles towards the back. My mom said now that this was when she started to realize something was up, but she didn't want to say anything because she didn't want to freak us out. So when we left the store, my mom took us towards the opposite end of the mall, keeping an eye out to see if the guys were still following us. And they were. We went into 2 or 3 more stores, and the guys followed us into each one. Not even shopping for anything, just looking at my brother, like these pedo sharks. At that point, my mom pulled me aside and told me what was going on. I'd noticed them, but I was 12, so I wasn't really thinking it was anything weird, until my mom confirmed that something really sketchy was happening. We decided we were going to leave since the parking lot was right outside and our car was close. But sure enough, the 2 guys started following us. My mom stopped, pretending to look in her purse for her keys, and they walked by us for a couple of minutes. Then one of them dropped something on the floor and stalled by pretending to look around for it. My mom looked at me and said, "Go find the cops." The mall we were at is in an urban area right outside of the Bronx, and it's fairly small, so it wasn't hard for me to find a couple of cops and tell them what was going on. I walked them back to where my family was still waiting, and I guess the 2 guys saw them because they jetted for the parking lot. The cops followed them, and my mom hauled ass back home with us. As far as I know, they got the plate number of the car the guys were in, and it turned out to be registered to some 90-year-old woman in Florida. That's all that really came of it, though. I don't know how scary this sounds to people who haven't experienced something like it, but I know that it freaked me out enough that even a few years later I still had nightmares about it. That the guys followed us home and murdered my family. My mom said it was one of the scariest things that's ever happened to her. Creepy teacher. When I was in my first year of high school, I had a teacher whose name was Dr. Johansson. He used to teach my civics class. He was a special fella, not like the other teachers. In the school I attended, teachers were often not close to students in a social way. They were simply there to teach, and that only. Dr. Johansson liked to keep contact with students, and so he decided it would be a lot easier to do so if he had a Facebook account. He started adding people on Facebook from our school, and they eventually started talking to him. He often posted weird stuff on his wall and made weird comments. For example, one time he posted the song Straight Outta Compton by NWA and wrote, "All they say is N-word, N-word, N-word. I don't get it." Of course, some students commented and asked him why he had used the N-word so freely. He removed the post and apologized and blamed it on being drunk. That was nothing. He started talking to students, mostly boys, and he managed to find some students' numbers and started sending them texts randomly. He would send stuff like, "Do you need help with your homework? You can come over to my place and I could help you out over a glass of wine." It goes without saying, he would say that to teens that were younger than 18 years old, so according to law they weren't allowed to drink, and he pretty much was offering alcohol to minors. And remember, he was a civics teacher. He knew that stuff by heart, and it was also morals, for God's sake. Anyway, he never sent me a text, but he sent some weird texts to my friends. Later on, though, he decided to talk to me. This was a couple of weeks after he had started contacting students like this. He would speak to me on Facebook chat and ask me things like, "How do you get girls? Do you have a big dick? Do you often sleep with the girls after your shows?" I'm an artist, and I found those messages highly disturbing. But they became worse. He said things like, "You must be a stallion in bed. You're probably really good." And one time he said, "Enter the rabbit hole with me. Come on, I'll take care of you." I mean, I had no clue what the fuck that meant, but that was not everything. After a while, things started to get out of control. He started asking me to go out with him to clubs, and I was not of age at that time. He said he could get me into the clubs with no ID and all would be well, and of course I said no. He then apparently got pissed at me and decided not to speak to me much after I turned him down a few times. He started talking to one of my close friends instead. That ended when Dr. Johansson sent my friend a picture of his ass with the caption, "Please take me from behind and take me hard." Mind you, my friend was 17 at the time, and while Dr. Johansson was in his mid-30s. That one was taken to court, and Dr. Johansson got his little sentence. He was to do community service for a little while, and then he was to pay my friend some fine. That was it. Dr. Johansson still works at that school today and is totally accepted. And I find that wrong, very wrong. A man like that should not be able to get in that line of work again. Things could have gotten much worse than they did. Strangeness in the Bayou. My uncle used to be a police officer, and one night while out on the beat, he received a call from an elderly couple way out in the boonies, so he and his partner went to check it out. When they got there, they approached the elderly couple's house very nonchalantly, because it was the boonies, and they figured the couple would call in some sort of animal report. Nope. The couple called in a report of strange chanting noises coming from behind their house by the bayou. "Well," my uncle said, and I'm using his own words here, "there's no fucking way I'm going near the goddamn bayou at 2 a.m, to which his partner replied, "Okay, fine, stay by the elderly couple. They'll protect you." So his partner walked off to the bayou and was gone for roughly 3 minutes before he started screaming for my uncle. My uncle ran out to him, and they didn't find anyone there, but they did find a small voodoo shrine with a freshly killed chicken. My uncle and his partner kicked the shrine over and threw the chicken into the bayou. They went back to the house and told the elderly couple that they just saw a gator in the water, and that what they had heard was probably a gator's mating call. Then, from what my uncle told me, they booked it right the hell out of there and never went back. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you've got a true scary story of any nature that you'd like to hear me narrate, email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you've got an extra minute in your life and you liked what you heard and you're listening to this on YouTube, please give the video a thumbs up and leave a comment. I'd like to know what you thought of the stories. If you haven't already subscribed, hey, why not do that too, and maybe even tell a friend. I'd appreciate it. Follow me on social media, and of course, if you'd like to take your support of this channel a bit further, find a link to my Patreon page in the description, or consider purchasing some Uncle Josh and Campfire Crew merchandise. A link to my TeePublic storefront is in the description as well. All the cool kids are doing it. Why don't you? Thanks again for bearing with me through this cold, and hopefully I am shaking it. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.